And nationalism, not just Judaism, have been a part of the problem. They've been part of what leads to bloodshed.
If you want to bomb Gaza and kill 1,400 people in a month, and you want to expect that this will have no effect in Tel Aviv, you have to be either extremely naive or extremely stupid.
Oh, we don't need Nazis here.
You hear that? Nazi. A Jew, a religious Jew calling another Jew a Nazi. That's the way they react. Nazi. That's a word that Jews don't use.
Welcome back to CrossTalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing if the United Nations is still relevant. And I'd like to go back to something you said earlier in the program, and looking at the Charter of the United Nations from 1940, I think it was October 1945, and look what it does today. In reading that document, did you would think ever that the United Nations be so involved in military conflicts, or what peacekeeping operations, where the road record, especially particularly since the end of the Cold War, has been a bit sketchy to say the least. And I'm thinking of Rwanda, I'm thinking of what's going on in Haiti. And of course, you know, it's looking at maybe Afghanistan and things like this. I mean, was the United Nations ever really, is it really built to be involved in that kind of thing? I mean, peacekeeping is when the war is over and you get on the ground. And in Libya, they took a side. They were the air force of a rebel group of people.
Well, reading the Charter, you'd like to think that war was going to be far more difficult to approach, far more difficult at least to get universal accreditation, legitimization. Unfortunately, that hasn't transpired. And as you put the examples that you mentioned, and I'd like to add to that, mentioning Iraq, and because you egged me in the first part to talk about Iraq, be it for 2003 and before the United Nations was totally sidelined by the United States and the United Kingdom, who had an agenda and wanted that legitimacy, as Thomas put it, and I totally agree with him, but they couldn't get it, so they went it alone, and it really didn't, you know, matter at all. Before that, for 13 years, the United Nations actually enforced sanctions on Iraq that reduced 25 million people to beggars, to people below the poverty line. So, in fact, you sort of feel that the United Nations, rather than being that kind of international body, that universal kind of element that the whole world subscribes to in order to protect the weak, it has become an arrow in the armors of the powerful nations under which they can go to war, they can impose any kind of sanctions regime, they can reduce any nation to poverty and to being hungry, and it just basically doesn't add up. And now I want to assert something quite important. I'm not calling for the demise or the downfall of the United Nations, not at all. I think that the world does need something to alternate from the kind of malice of the superpowers that we have today, driven by mere interest, crass, raw interest. I think we do need that. The United Nations, as it stands, according to the kind of levels and hierarchy and structures, the veto system, talk about many, many other things, I think it's not working, and we need a serious reconsideration of exactly what it stands for.
Thomas, what do you think about that? I mean, again, looking at the Charter, it's more about protection of the sovereignty of states, and that what we've seen since the end of the Cold War is undermining the sovereignty of states, or threatening to do so, or we having Western powers on the Security Council saying this person is no longer fit to rule. Is that what the Charter was supposed to be all about? I mean, it sounds like it's a pulpit to lecture people. Go ahead.
There is nothing that is not in the Charter. So whether we're talking about economic and social issues, human rights, going to war, disarmament. So it's a little hard to pin all of this down. What I would have to say, in contrast to the former speaker, is that in fact, the institution occasionally performs, usually it does not. This is not the result of the UN per se. Dick Holbrooke, when he was alive, used to say blaming the UN for many of the decisions is like blaming Madison Square Garden for the poor basketball record of the New York Knicks. It's the people who inhabit the building who make the decisions. The states who are responsible. So occasionally they come together. In the first Persian Gulf War in 1991 was one occasion. In Libya, another occasion. In between, there were lots of dismal occasions on which no decisions were made. But occasionally, and I would say Libya is the most recent example, what comes together is the politics, the capacity, the moral argument, and the legal argument, and there is action. Next door in Syria, none of those happens to be present, so there is no action. It's hard to blame the United Nations rather than its 193 members.
Okay, well, Ruth, I mean, if we can stick with Libya, I mean, look at 1973. I guess we can agree or disagree on this in one form or another, but a resolution was passed, but NATO was given a mandate because of the resolution to do far, far more than what that resolution had to say. And that, is that do you find that to be dangerous, a dangerous precedent, or will the great powers avoid that again? That was just a one-off thing? Because when reading the resolution, when what we saw happen, the thousands of sorties that were dropped on Libya, that didn't seem to be part of the resolution, and the United Nations sanctioned that.
Well, it's I think one of the great dilemmas in international politics and security affairs is it actually is very hard to persuade or coerce interlocutors to do things. And Gaddafi's been a wily fox for a very long time, and I think everybody would agree quite a bad actor in fomenting terrible civil wars in West Africa, in making trouble in Chad, in the Lockerbie bombing, and he's just really been quite an irresponsible fella. But it's true that Security Council language often is a bit vague, that the degree of coercion that's necessary, whether it's something like Kosovo or Libya, is always unfathomable at the beginning of a campaign. Wars, like peace, is always more difficult than you expect it to be. But I do think that, I think Dick Hallberg did have it right, that what's often at fault is the way the political system's organized. I do think that there are changes one should make. I do think that regional groups shouldn't vote as blocks the way they do, because they, like Chicago clubhouses, manage to coerce their members because all good things come from your regional group. So it's not an ideal Habermasian situation of reflection. It's a very political system. The politics could use some reforming.
Well, that's the politics of it. I mean, Ennis, you know, I don't think anyone on the panel here is going to defend Mr. Gaddafi, okay? I certainly won't. But just what Ruth described, you could say that what the great powers have done through the Arab Middle East for the last 60 years, okay? I mean, you know,
well, that's,
go ahead.
Well, that's exactly the point. I mean, the thing is, I agree entirely. I mean, the United Nations is not an entity that, you know, in itself creates these policies. It's the powers that use the United Nations, that use the halls of the United Nations, and the system upon which the United Nations is built to allow those powers to act in the way that they do in order to exacerbate the situations of many and to further and promote their policies. And, you know, I agree, Peter. You know, we can talk about the list of crimes committed by Saddam Hussein, and we would be right. We could talk about the crimes of al-Qaddafi, and we would be right. But what about the crimes of other nations, particularly the nations that are seen as being respectable, the nations that are seen to be beyond reproach, those who use the halls of the United Nations to pursue their powers? The problem is, and this is where I talk about the United Nations and I criticize the United Nations. I say that because it still embodies this kind of universality, this kind of global, you know, consent, global coming together, and that respectability, that is why it is being used and abused by those who have the political clout and the military clout and the economic pressure in order to further their policies, which may at times be totally inhumane, but give it that aura of respectability. So in a sense, the United Nations is not doing what the Charter said it should do. Actually, what it's doing, it's helping, you know, certain wars, certain interests being promoted in a crass, uncivil, totally brutal way, but with an aura of respectability.
What do you think about that, Thomas? I mean, it sounds like...
Wait a minute.
Go ahead.
Well,
Go ahead, jump in.
I was going to contrast. It seems to me that I would totally agree with the 2003 pursuit of the Iraq War. It seems to me if we're talking about Libya, it's totally different. I mean, this time, no state voted against it. There were 5 abstentions, but no state had voted against it. You had regional support, Arab League, Gulf Cooperation Council, African Union. You had participation from, albeit small, from a couple of Arab states, namely Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. So it seems to me that this is really quite remarkably different from the 2003 Iraq decision, much more akin to what the Charter envisaged in the first place. And so I'm actually relatively sanguine. I would say that in particular the UN and the responsibility to protect is alive and well after Libya, much more alive and well than it was before.
What do you think about...
Thomas, you wrote about the United Nations. If I may, Peter, jump in. Thomas, you wrote about the United Nations. In reality, if we were to propose a hypothetical that tomorrow the United States or the United Kingdom decide to go on a war and the United Nations Security Council doesn't give that, you know, there's Russia or China or whoever vetoing that particular decision, then they decide to step-toe the United Nations and go to war regardless. What can the United Nations do? In reality, they can do absolutely nothing. And that is where the problem is. Absolutely, I agree with you entirely. It's a body without any tooth.
If I could jump in.
Go ahead, Ruth, jump in.
Yeah, because I do think before we to reduce this to a debate about whether colonialism still persists in attitude or fact, one should not neglect the other half, the other three-quarters of the United Nations, which is doing humanitarian aid around the world, where the United Nations is the central organizing mechanism for the delivery of food aid, for famine, for post-war conflict, for post-war relief, that many of the voluntary agencies of the UN, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Program, are essential organs. So to blackguard the UN using the Security Council as the only face of the UN, whatever one's view of it, is a real reductionism. Yeah. So in attacking the corporate logo,
Ruth,
so to say, beware of collateral damage.
I totally agree with you.
Okay.
I totally agree with you, Ruth, but guess what? Most of that humanitarian aid is dropped on areas where wars were allowed to happen in the first place.
Okay, Thomas, I'm going to give the last word on this program, how to fix the United Nations in a few sentences. Go ahead.
How to fix it. Well, I'm going to urge people to buy my book and thereby increase my royalties. The problem with trying to reform the United Nations is trying to get everyone on the same page. Part of the book argues that, in fact, you know, the ideal should not be the enemy of the good. So the fact that we are not moving in Syria should not make us sad about having done something occasionally in a place like Libya. It also talks about getting much more from those units that Ruth spoke about. There are enormous
I'm afraid we've run out of time, folks. Very, very good, interesting conversation. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, New York, and in Birmingham. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.